Detective J. Warner Wallace is a renowned cold case detective who has solved a number of nearly unsolvable murders. He has been featured on Dateline more than any other cold case detective. As a former atheist, Detective Wallace attempted to use his skills as a detective to disprove Christianity. His investigation resulted in verifying the truth of the Bible. He's an author, an apologist, a national Christian speaker, and today he joins us on the Biblical Worldview Show. And we're back with Detective Jim Wallace. Jim, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, glad to be with you. This is good. Second, number 2 is going to be better than number 1. We're going to do an even better job than last time. How's that?
Is that possible, though? That's the question. So
I'm sure. Of course it is.
We are talking about the book, The Truth in True Crime. And this is the book that I'm already on round 2 of rereading. And I'm telling you, there's not a lot of there's prescriptive biblical worldview books, like here's what a biblical worldview is. There's a lot of apologetic books, but this book not only merges biblical worldview and apologetics in theory, but it's in practice. It's real stories that apply to real life. And it's it really is an amazing help to the believer. So definitely something you want to check out, but we're going to ask you some questions today. But before we get to these questions, you still live in California. I love asking people, do you have any intentions of leaving California, and why do you still live there? Though my parents lived there for years, and it's such a beautiful state, so I get it. But I think there's a lot of people that are like wondering, why California?
Well, born and raised here, so that was
Wow.
just kind of where we started. So, been here my whole life. I love the climate here for sure. Not the political climate, but I love the actual weather climate here is just awesome, and that's hard to leave. But more importantly, I think I would have probably jettisoned out. I've got my kids are now kind of spreading out of different locations. But my granddaughter, which you might hear at some point in the background, is with us 4 days a week, and she's right down the road. So I probably, because of her, I will probably die right here in this room, possibly, because I'm not going to leave, go anywhere where I won't be able to see her on a daily basis. So that's part of that we were talking about in the last session about identity.
Yeah.
So if you don't know what we're talking about, you can go back and listen to that. But I think that's part of it. What helped me to kind of get a grip on what was important about who I am was the addition of another child. That kind of makes, okay, that if you're going to be something, if you're going to invest in something, what better thing to invest in than your own grandkids? So it did change the trajectory of my decision making as far as where I'm going to live.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. Oh, well, in fact, I had a long conversation yesterday with Mike Winger, the
Yep.
YouTuber, and I asked him the same question. I'm like, man, because it's incredible. But away from California politics, which, by the way, if you've never been to the state of California, you really are missing. It really is a wonderful state. It get such a bad rap among conservatives, and the politics are really sad. But it is one of the most beautiful places. In a couple weeks, I'm going to be speaking at the Reagan Presidential Library, which is in Simi Valley. It's beautiful out there. It is amazing. And so you got to go explore California. I'm curious, have you ever been to San Luis Obispo?
Oh, of course.
Oh,
my wife.
That's where my dad. That's where my dad pastored. That area.
Oh well, my wife and my son both went to Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara. So we were pretty close to San Luis Obispo. So yeah, though that's to me, that's about as far north as you want to go from a weather perspective. It's a little dicey up there, if you ask me. So really,
I love that cooler weather. I love it.
I know when people think of California, though, of Southern California and the weather, I think they're thinking of San Diego mostly, and I'm pretty close to San Diego. So I'm between San Diego and Los Angeles. But yeah, I think that's part of it is the weather is really good. And yes, there are some things about the politics that you would say, well, is my voice even here? Is my worldview even represented here? It turns out that you'd be surprised that it actually is. We're here. We just happen to be dominated on the news by people who aren't Christians for the most part.
One of the things we love to talk about
Hmm.
is work as worship, as everything I do in life as worship, because that really is what it means to have a biblical worldview. As I'm looking at that, and you talked about worship in the
Yeah.
book, and we have a universal desire to worship. How does that this either aid us or inhibit us when it comes to flourishing our desire to worship?
Okay, so this is a book that has 15 crime stories that teach 15 principles for human flourishing, and then we show you how they're confirmed by studies and also how they're confirmed in the pages of the New Testament. And this is a chapter you're talking about that I thought was, as I rethink it, and I think about this a lot, it's really a chapter about worship and idolatry because we all are worshipers. Everyone is a worshiper. Whether you worship the God of the universe, there is something that for you is of primary importance. It is the thing you are willing to carve your calendar around. It is the thing you're willing to spend your money on.
Yep.
It's the thing you're always talking about. It's the thing you're most eagerly anticipating. It's the stuff that kind of orders your life that you're willing to submit to. It's your master. It's just the truth. And most of the time, what we do is instead of worshiping the creator of the universe, we worship something that he has created for our good and to glorify him, but we have twisted it and turned it into an idol. And it turns out they're always in three categories. So murder investigators, we don't spend a lot of time going, oh, I wonder why anyone would kill this woman. But there's only three reasons why anyone would kill anyone. Only three. It is sex, money, and the pursuit of power. That's it. There's not a fourth category. And these are the three categories that we typically have been given to us by God for a good purpose, but that we have perverted in some way and made overly important. We've now made an idol out of these three things. So much so that if somebody was to even suggest, to question, to damage, to scratch this idol that we've made, we're willing to kill them. And so this is a story in the book about somebody who was in our town, who was part of our homeless community, and it was canning, just collecting recyclables. And every day his pattern was that he would collect recyclables till about 2 o'clock, go to the recycling center, cash them in, and then he would go to the liquor store and he would buy alcohol and maybe get one meal. But if he couldn't find the meal, he'd just drink alcohol. That was just his life pattern. And he did this for years. And he looked like Santa Claus, so everyone called him Santa Claus. And he was an older guy, white hair, white beard. So when he gets stabbed one night, I'm thinking to myself, I got to sign the case. And they stabbed him as he was coming out of where he was sleeping in a porta potty by a construction site. And somebody rocked it. He came out. They stabbed him, left him for dead. And I thought, how does anyone gain in the only three reasons why anyone does a murder, sex, money, and power? What does this guy offer in these three categories? It was perplexing to me, but it turns out it was a great example of why the danger of idols. Because there was another younger guy in the community, also homeless, who had a very similar daily pattern. And Santa Claus had slipped over into an alley that contained a couple of dumpsters that this younger guy thought, oh, those are mine. That's my part of this town. And how much money do you think this guy is harvesting off this young guy's back? Not much, a couple of dollars a day, maybe $1.50 in recyclables. But if you create an idol, the smallest thing will offend you if it's in the category of that idol. The other thing was when he finally confronted Santa Claus about it at a recycling center, hey, dude, you're in my alley. That's my alley. Santa Claus just kind of blew him off. He didn't say anything harsh to him. He just disregarded him as though he didn't matter. Like there's a fly flying around here. I'm just going to swat it away. Well, that disrespect in front of their peers, that was another idol for him. So in that one moment, he had now triggered two idols. The money, which was overly important to this younger guy, and two, the respect in the community. Power. That's in the power category. And for those two reasons alone, he was willing to kill this guy. Now, this is what happens when we stop one level short of the creator when we direct our worship. If we stop one level short, and instead of going all the way to the creator, we stop at the level of his creation, we will make an idol. And I discovered that if you have made an idol of something, if these three impulses that we have to do stupid things, if you scratch one of these impulses, you will scratch the other two. You can't begin to scratch any of them. And that's why sometimes you could argue that all crime is simply as misplaced worship. It's the consequence of misplaced worship, because we have now created an idol that we're willing to not only die for, but to kill somebody else for it. So it's important, I think, for us to identify where. That's what I try to do in this chapter, is give you 12 questions you could ask yourself. Some are obvious, some are not, that'll help you identify your idols so you can redirect your worship.
Worship oftentimes has more to do with why we are doing what we are doing than what we are actually doing. But then ultimately, our why does dictate our end goals. One of the things I thought we would talk a little bit more about apologetics today, but this is the whole new Jim Wallace,
Yeah.
who does both.
Yeah.
But one of the things that fascinates me about atheists is, why is it so important that I believe this if you really are an atheist? Being consistent with that worldview, what are you doing this for? It's not even consistent with, if there is no God, what do you care what I believe? And it is amazing how, as believers, we are often, our worship is not consistent with our stated beliefs of Christianity. We can keep digging into this more with Detective Jim Wallace when we come back. And I want to ask him why he thinks that so many law enforcement officers, why is divorce so high there? And it's certainly not just high with LEOs. It's high in our society. It's far too high. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, its relation to true crime. When we come back, more discussion with Detective Jim Wallace and his book, The Truth in True Crime. The Biblical Worldview Show is a ministry of RenewaNation in partnership with the Center for Truth and Love. We are supported by faithful partners who want to invest in life-saving and life-changing kingdom impact. If the show is helpful to you, you can support us by subscribing, following, and sharing. You also can support us through giving. Make a tax-deductible financial investment today at RenewaNation.org. Our culture is increasing in skepticism. Therefore, they want scientific verification and increased evidences. And when you look at the gospel is certainly entered into by faith, but many believers refuse to even give the evidence that underpins the gospel. This is contrary to the command in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be ready to give an answer, and the subsequent verses, which say that the answer should be so effective that those that challenge the Christian faith should be somewhat embarrassed that they would raise the objection because the answer is so good. Most believers are not equipped to fulfill this command. And so we wanted to create a resource that would cover the most basic objections to the Christian faith and provide evidence that the believer can offer. Does God exist? Is the Bible reliable? Why does God allow evil? And did Jesus rise from the dead? Those are the 4 objections that cover the scope of the gospel and that you'll find in our Gospel Evidences resource. I'm very excited about this. And we're back. We just were talking about worship, and I feel like I cut you off just there. You had something that was bubbling up, and I hope you didn't forget it in the break. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Detective Wallace?
Well, what you're just saying, you're already heading toward it. It's good things are the things that we turn into idols. They're good things. They are intended for our good. I know what my idols are. And I know it's whatever it was I was worshiping long before I knew the God of the universe. And I didn't become a Christian until I was 35. Susie and I were together for 18 years before we became Christians. My God was marriage. My idol was marriage. My parents were divorced early in the 60s. That was not common. And so I was raised by myself and didn't like it. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to let that happen again. So I had made an idol of marriage. And this is, now you asked the question before the break, which I think is a good one. Why do you think with law officers, it turns out, if you look at the data on this, it's not as bad as it looks. It turns out that we don't really divorce much higher rate than the general population. But what you caught was correct, that it turns out that the population is divorcing at a very high rate.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is because we don't hold a biblical worldview anymore about marriage. That's why I had to do a chapter on marriage. I felt like it was important for us to discuss what the differences are, because it turns out the only group that does a better job at marriage are committed Christians. Because if you look at the people who claim a Christian identity, the
Yes.
stats are about the same as they are for the
Right.
general population. But if you can say, well, okay, well, if you're a Christian though, and you're a committed Christian, that would probably result in certain behavioral outcomes. So let's go ahead and just interview the Christians that display the commitment in their behavior. Not their behavior in marriage, but I mean, like, they're church attending, Bible reading. They'll tell you this, that, yeah, I'm in scripture every day. Let's ask them and see where they are. Well, when you isolate it just down to people who don't just claim a Christian identity, but actually are committed to their Christian worldview, you'll see that the divorce rates are way lower.
Yeah.
And so it
So
turns
we
out
can
that that's the only category that protects you from stupid is this belief that we're actually forming a covenant with a holy God.
we can officially dismantle the lie that the divorce rate in the church is the same as in the world, which I've heard over and over and over
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
And statistically, it is not true. Glenn Stanton actually wrote a whole article about
Yes.
this, and I know.
That's got great work.
But the
Yeah.
Bible, and that shows you something. The Bible matters. It actually
Yeah.
does. So you go, well, I'm a Christian. Well, those are just words unless you're living out the truth of the Bible, and all of a sudden you start. Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So
Sorry.
what I tried to do in this chapter on this particular, because let's face it, if you're watching Datelines, these are almost all spousal murders. If
Wow.
I look at my caseload, you'll see that they're dominated by people who are killing their spouse. Now, that's not a coincidence. That's just sadly what happens when we have a certain approach to marriage that's different, right? If I think everything in marriage is contractual and it is transactional. In other words, I'll do this for you if I get this in return. Well, that's the way the world works. That's the way meritocracy works. That's the way our secular society works. I do this in exchange for that. And if that's what marriage is, then you can expect that every way that transactional way of looking at things fails in the real world, isn't it's going to, it'll also fail in your marriage. You have to rethink your worldview first. So if I looked at the kinds of trajectory decisions, and if I had to prioritize a pyramid of important decisions to make early while you're still in high school, the first decision would be worldview. Is Christianity true? Do you know why it's true? Do you live as though it's true? Are you committed to it as the single object of your worship? Then 2 would be spouse. Before education, before mission, before what you think of your purpose. No. 2, after you know you're going to love God, you got to figure out, what am I going to do as far as a spouse? You're going to be married to something, according to Paul. You're either going to be married to the mission of advancing the gospel. And Paul says, I'd rather you just be married to that. Yeah. But if you're not married to that singularly, you're going to be married to a woman or a man singularly, right? You're going to be married if you're a woman. And by the way, what kind of marriage? It doesn't matter. So we've taken this word marriage, we've applied it to every kind of union, same-sex union, whatever you can think of. Now, I suppose going forward, we're going to have polyamorous kinds of unions. Who knows where the future holds? But the data is pretty consistent, especially if marriage is something that as a society we want to develop as an institution so we can protect the future of children, the next generation of taxpayers, if that's all our intention was. Well, then we could focus on the one type of union that produces the best next generation of citizens, law-abiding people who actually are going to advance the culture. And it turns out that union is 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting. I wish there was another way to say this, because I wasn't raised that way. I was raised by 1 biological parent in a pretty chaotic home. And it was not what I would want. And I raised a blended family. I've got 2 biological children, and we adopted 2 kids out of foster care. And so we don't, I get it. There's lots of ways to have family, but that one family tradition of 2 biologicals in a low conflict setting is still statistically the best way to flourish.
So I think this is a great transition between what is, what isn't, and the hope and grace of the gospel. So here you have a man that is going like, here's the best way. But you also have a guy that by any measure Well, that's another rabbit trail I'd love to chase at some point too. But I'm like, by any measure, when I sit here and I look at all that you've accomplished. I mean, you've been interviewed on Dateline more than anyone else. You've solved these incredible, like these impossible, like no one could figure it out, but you could. And now you write books and you travel across the country. Anyone goes, this man is incredibly successful, and I don't think that would be an untrue thing. And once again, you're saying I don't want to be a celebrity, and I'm just trying to say empirically, and yet you came out of a family that where the odds were against you.
That's right.
It doesn't mean that the goal is, well, the answer here is single moms, right? Like the answer here is not having not having both parents in the picture in a committed relationship. That's not the answer, but what it does indicate is that there is hope even in the middle of brokenness. And you talk about this in your book, and I'd love it, just kind of as we close out here, give us like you're in a place where I think reaching for hope is probably difficult. I mean, after a while, you talk about gallows humors in the book. I do think it would be difficult to regularly show up to crime scenes and to deal with some of the things you do, and yet you're a very well-established, enjoyable person. How do you have hope in dark times? And I know maybe it's not looking at a crime scene, but I know there's probably a lot of people listening right now that are going like, man, my situation is not a hopeful one. Could you give us some encouragement and maybe some thoughts as you spoke about it in the book?
Well, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, I would think if you just stop my story as a child, it would look pretty bleak. This does not mean, for every statistical study we do, there'll be an anomaly. And I think I was an anomaly in some ways. But that doesn't mean we should stop aiming at what the optimal form should be. And so I think there's hope. Look, we record depression, and studies that record depression, and it's on the increase globally, but certainly nationally also. And hopelessness is a key ingredient of depression. It's almost always in the first line of any survey, any study, any research you read. Hopelessness is really, if you think about it, I remember listening to Tim Keller talk about this, where he argued that really, if you want to become hopeless, if you're an atheist, just think deeply about your worldview. Because if atheism is true, the reality of it is no one's going to survive the grave. No one's going to survive this little speck of data, this little speck of time in the historical timeline. This universe is going to collapse of a heat death. No one's going to remember any of this. It does not matter in the least because it won't survive. But it turns out, and Keller said this too, that if you wanted to have hope as a Christian, you simply need to think more deeply about your worldview. If you're an atheist, you need to think less deeply about it because it'll give you depression. If you're a Christian, you need to think more deeply about your worldview because we have what secular studies call the persisting self in our worldview. The idea people have more hope if they believe that their self will persist beyond the grave. The self that contains your memories, your relationships, everything that's you. Because if you believe in reincarnation, well, you'll kind of persist beyond the grave, but not the same self you are today. And if you believe in atheism, well, then you don't persist beyond the grave at all. And if you think that the entire world, like a Near Eastern view, that everything is an illusion anyway, look, it turns out the Christian worldview has more resources to deal with suffering than any other worldview on planet Earth because it offers hope. And the last chapter of this book, the cure for every kind of stupid you can think of, because the gospel is the cure for stupid, because all stupid is driven by prideful sin, selfishness, our thinking that we are our own gods of our own universes and we can do anything we want without repercussion. That is really behind every kind of stupid: marriage stupid, relationship stupid, institutional stupid, government stupid, international politics stupid. Every kind of stupid, it probably has at its top people who think too highly of themselves and in their pride. So what is the solution for these problems? It's the same solution that there exists for sin. The only solution for sin happens to be the solution for every kind of stupid, because every kind of stupid is rooted in sin. So it turns out that you can have hope, but if you're just trusting yourself to fix every problem you have in your life right now, I can see why you're hopeless, and you should be. On the other hand, if you can surrender this to a God who has far more power than we have, you ought to have just the opposite. And that's why it's important for us to figure out what is true about the world. If Christianity is not true, walk away from it now, because you need to figure out what is true. But if it is true, you need to be all in, and be all in right now. because it represents the thing that'll actually answer every question you're going to have for the rest of your life.
Oh, thank you for ending that on hope. And when you deal with your job on a lot of hopeless situations, I imagine that it is a regular comfort to know that there is life beyond this, that Jesus is alive from the dead, and that a worship of him brings real fulfillment and meaning and purpose. And wow, you have an amazing ministry, and I imagine there's probably some people that still have yet to not have heard from you, and a great way to be introduced to Jim Wallace is to do what if they want to get to know you a little more after this interview.
Well, okay, a couple of things. We have a website called coldcasechristianity.com that has all of the free articles, resources, videos that we've been offering for 15 years. But for this book, there's a website called thetruthandtruecrime.com. And what we try to do there is say, yes, we have a book. And if you do buy that book, though, I want to give you something that's of far more value than the book. And so what we try to do there is offer a free 10.5-hour course, 30 sessions, so you can learn the Christian worldview from 0 to 50. And you can get that for free with the purchase of the book. That's at thetruthandtruecrime.com.
Cool. A great person to follow. And then you can get this book, The Truth in True Crime. I highly recommend it. And here's one way to use this book. If you're a mom or a dad and you're going, I'm looking for ways to make biblical worldview shaping interesting, take a chapter, read it together, and then discuss it. And there's so many life lessons in here. So Detective Jim Wallace, thank you so much for your kindness and taking time to be on the Biblical Worldview Show and to share some of your life experiences and the truth in this book with us. We sure appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Hey, you're still here. Thank you so much for watching the Biblical Worldview Show. Our show is supported by financial investments from viewers just like you. If you'd like to make a donation to the Biblical Worldview Show, you can do so by going to RenewaNation.org. And don't forget to subscribe and follow our show.